You wake before the sun touches the horizon. Not because a bell rings, not because someone calls your name. You wake because the temple does not sleep, and you are part of its body. The air inside your cell is thick. Mud brick holds the heat of the previous day and releases it slowly through the night. But by the early hours, it turns stale, pressed in, carrying the smell of bodies, lamp oil, and the residue of yesterday's grain offering still clinging to the walls. Your sleeping mat is woven reed. It crackles when you move. Your robe is rough linen, stiff at the edges where sweat dried and crystallized overnight. You pull it on in darkness. There is no window in this room. Light comes through a narrow opening near the ceiling, too high to see through, wide enough only to let in air that isn't moving. You can already hear it. The courtyard below, the sound of water being poured, the drag of heavy stone, voices in a low register performing words you have said so many times they no longer feel like language. They feel like breath, automatic, necessary. The first ritual of the day begins before you eat, before you drink, before your eyes fully adjust to the lamplight. The god must be woken, the offerings must be prepared. The sequence must be correct. You move through corridors that smell of cedar smoke and something underneath it. Animal fat, old grain, the faint rot of organic matter in the drainage channels running beneath the stone floor. The ziggurat rises above everything outside, and even from here, deep in the lower complex, you feel its mass pressing down through the architecture. Everything connects to it. Every room, every passageway, every storage chamber, organized in concentric logic around the divine center that you will spend your entire day serving. This is not devotion. This is labor with a sacred name. The Sumerian temple worked. It fed thousands, stored surplus grain across seasons, administered trade across hundreds of kilometers, adjudicated disputes, managed livestock herds, employed weavers, brewers, metalworkers, scribes, and priests of every rank. It was the most sophisticated organizational system in the ancient world. For the people who lived inside it, this meant one thing. You belonged to something larger than yourself, and that thing had no interest in your exhaustion. To understand your place inside this world, you have to understand how completely the temple owns you. Sumer in the 3rd millennium BCE is a land of city-states, Ur, Uruk, Nippur, Lagash, each one anchored by a temple complex that is simultaneously a house of the god, a granary, a treasury, a court, and a factory. The god does not merely reside here. The god owns the land. You work it on the god's behalf. The surplus you generate does not belong to you. It flows upward through a hierarchy so precisely ordered that clay tablets record every transaction, every jar of oil, every ration of barley, every fleece sheared from the temple flock. At the top of this structure sits the En or the Ensi, the high priest or city governor, often the same person, the intermediary between divine will and human administration. Below them, a layered order of priests, each with designated functions, ranked access to the inner sanctuary, and fixed rations calibrated to status. Below the priests, the temple workers, weavers, brewers, bakers, herdsmen, laborers who receive their daily ration from the institutional hand that employs them. You do not negotiate your wage. You do not choose your task. The tablet that records your assignment was written before you arrived. If you are a lower-ranking priest, a purification priest, a musician, a dream interpreter, a temple baker, your day is structured by rotation. Duties cycle through a calendar that the temple administers with the same precision it applies to the lunar calendar governing ritual. You know when you are on watch. You know when you must fast. You know which days require full ritual dress and which days permit ordinary robes. Missing a rotation is not a personal failure, it is a structural offense. The record exists. The scribe has noted your name, and the god, the administrators believe, has noticed too. Now that you understand the architecture of obligation you inhabit, the question that follows is unavoidable. What does this system extract from your body every day? The work begins before sunrise, and it does not follow the logic of fatigue. The first duties of the day are the most sacred, and physically, the most demanding. The god must be fed. This means preparing a formal meal. Bread baked to specification, beer brewed to the correct strength, roasted meat from animals slaughtered according to ritual law, fish if the season permits, alongside oil, honey, and date cakes arranged on vessels of clay or metal. The kitchen complex of a major temple like that of Nana in Ur employs dozens of workers processing these offerings daily. You are not a cook. You are a priest participating in the feeding of a divine body. But the physical work is identical. Grinding grain before dawn, hauling water from storage cisterns, tending fires that produce enough heat to make the room nearly unbreathable in summer. Clay tablets from Lagash record the quantities involved. Hundreds of liters of beer, dozens of loaves, multiple animal carcasses, processed and presented daily, without pause, without exception for weather, illness, or the mood of the workers. If the offering is incomplete, the ritual is invalid. If the ritual is invalid, the divine protection over the city is compromised. The logic is circular and binding. You do not stop. By mid-morning, your hands are burnt from the fire. Your back carries the accumulated weight of hours of lifting, pouring, and carrying. There is no formal rest period between the morning presentation and the preparation for the midday offering. The god eats 3 times a day. Your shift does not end between meals. But even when the offerings are complete, the body's obligations have not been met. What you eat is not what you prepare. The temple feeding system is precise and hierarchical. Rations are distributed according to rank, recorded on clay, and collected at designated points. A high priest receives a substantial allocation: bread, beer, oil, meat on ritual days. A lower temple worker, a weaver or porter in the outer complex, receives a survival ration: barley, some oil, occasionally fish or legumes. The barley is your caloric foundation. It fills the stomach, but it does not protect the body. Consumed in large quantities over years, a diet dominated by grain with minimal protein and fat produces specific damage. Dental erosion from the grit mixed into stone ground flour, bone density loss, inflammation in joints that never fully rest. Skeletal remains from Mesopotamian urban sites of this period show patterns consistent with chronic nutritional stress. Not acute starvation, but the slow compression of a body that is never fully nourished. The people who built and maintained these temple complexes were not starving in the way that leaves visible record in a single season of failure. They were depleted over lifetimes of adequate but insufficient feeding. The ration sustained the labor. It was designed to do exactly that, nothing more. On ritual feast days, portions increased. Meat appeared. Beer flowed in greater quantities. These days were real. The relief was real. But they did not undo the cumulative account. And feast days required additional physical labor from the very people they were meant to reward. Even when your body is fed, there is another calculation running in the background. The temple is the cleanest place in the city. This is part of its theology. Purity is not merely symbolic. It is operational. Priests undergo regular purification, ritual washing, dietary restrictions before certain ceremonies, prohibitions against contact with the dead, with menstruating women, with specific animals or foods, depending on role. You wash before the morning offering. You wash before entering the inner sanctuary. You wash after handling specific materials. Water is a technology of sacred maintenance. And yet the water that flows through the temple complex comes from the same source that waters the city. The Euphrates carries silt, organic matter, the runoff of human and animal habitation upstream. Cisterns collect and store it. Contamination is not visible. It has no smell when it is mild. The connection between water and illness is not understood. Not in the way that changes behavior. Not yet. People who drink contaminated water do not know they are doing so. They know only that sometimes the stomach turns and the fever rises and the strength leaves the body without explanation. Intestinal disease is chronic in this environment. Dysentery, its ancient equivalents, moves through densely populated institutional complexes with efficiency. The dormitories where lower-ranking priests and workers sleep are tight. Reed mats collect moisture. Rodents enter through the same channels used for drainage. Fleas and lice are not extraordinary. They are the condition. The purification rituals of the temple priesthood create a psychological architecture of cleanliness that coexists with a material reality of constant low-level biological threat. Priests perform the rites of bodily purity inside a building that cannot fully protect them from the contamination their theology most fears. The body you offer to the god is the body you are slowly losing. There is something inside this world that nobody names directly, something that the theology of the temple was built in part to manage, and that the management made worse. The dead inside the temple complex were not strangers, they were your colleagues. When a priest died from illness, from the accumulated weight of a life of service, from one of the fevers that periodically swept through the lower city and climbed the ziggurat steps, the body was handled with ritual precision. Funerary rites were performed, offerings were made. The bureaucracy of death was as organized as the bureaucracy of grain. But the royal tombs excavated at Ur revealed something that archaeology took time to fully absorb. The individuals buried alongside high-ranking figures, courtiers, musicians, soldiers, servants, did not show signs of struggle. They were found in ordered positions, with their instruments beside them, their dress intact, their hands in their laps. The physical evidence suggests they were sedated, possibly poisoned, and they went willingly, or were made to go in a state that resembled willingness. This was not understood as violence by the people who administered it. It was understood as service, the highest form of service, the continuation of duty beyond the boundary of individual life. You do not merely serve the god in this world. In the theology of early Sumer, certain individuals were required to continue serving in the next. The logic of total institutional belonging extended past death. You were not sacrificed. You were promoted into an eternal rotation. The tablet does not record whether anyone refused. The temple administers justice. This is not metaphor, it is function. Disputes over land boundaries, inheritance, debt, contract violations, and theft are adjudicated by temple authority. The god witnesses all agreements. Clay tablets recording transactions are sealed with cylinder seals and stored in the temple archive. When a dispute arises, the relevant tablet is retrieved. The evidence is the document. The document is sacred. What this means in practice is that the temple holds permanent power over the economic life of everyone in its orbit. Debts incurred against the temple are debts against the divine. Defaulting on a temple loan is not merely a financial failure, it is a religious offense. Debt slavery, the condition in which a person or their family members work off a debt through labor, is documented in Sumerian records from this period. A farmer who borrows grain seed during a drought and cannot repay after a poor harvest does not simply owe money. He may owe years of his children's labor to the institutional creditor that is simultaneously his god's earthly body. The scribes who record these transactions are not corrupt. The system is not broken. It functions precisely as designed. The temple accumulates resources. The resources sustain the ritual. The ritual sustains the city. The people who are absorbed into debt servitude to make this cycle possible are not victims of a failure. They are the operational cost of a system that considers their condition acceptable. Records from Lagash include administrative lists of women and children working in temple weaving houses on reduced rations. Their names are there. Their labor is quantified. Their freedom is not mentioned because it was not part of the accounting. The law does not protect you. It accounts for you. If you are a woman inside this system, the walls are closer. Female priests existed in Sumer, and some held extraordinary power. The end priestess of Nana at Ur was one of the most politically significant figures in the city-state, a position sometimes held by daughters of kings, women of astronomical and theological authority whose voices shaped ritual, calendar, and cosmology. The poetry attributed to Enheduanna, daughter of Sargon of Akkad, High Priestess of Ur, survives as some of the oldest signed literary work in human history. This is real. This matters. But this is also the apex. For the vast majority of women working within or adjacent to the temple economy, the weavers in the weaving houses, the women listed in ration tablets as wives of soldiers or female workers of the god, the experience was radically different. Weaving houses attached to temple complexes employed large numbers of women and children, many of them dependents of soldiers killed in service, refugees absorbed into the institutional labor pool, or individuals delivered into the system through debt mechanisms. Their rations were smaller than men's performing equivalent labor. Their mobility was restricted. Their children, daughters especially, entered the same system. A woman at the lower levels of the temple economy does not serve the god through prayer or ritual. She serves through her hands, which work the loom from before light until after dark, producing textiles that the temple trades across the region. Her body is part of the output. Her name appears in the record not as a person, but as a unit of production assigned to a specific task in a specific room of a specific institution that has existed longer than she has and will continue after she is gone. The god receives the cloth. The woman receives the ration. The record does not ask whether this was just. When the system cracks, it cracks fast. The history of Sumerian city-states is a history of cycles: consolidation, peak, destabilization, collapse. And the mechanisms of collapse were almost never external at the start. They began inside the same interlocking systems that made the cities functional. Drought reduced harvests. Reduced harvests meant reduced offerings, which meant reduced rations for the workers who maintained the complex. Workers weakened by reduced rations produced less. Production deficits accumulated in the archive as tablet after tablet recording shortfall. The scribes kept writing even as the numbers deteriorated. The ritual calendar continued even as the grain stores shrank. When floods damaged the irrigation channels that fed the agricultural land the temple administered, the repair required coordinated labor, the same labor now operating at reduced capacity because the rations that sustained it were themselves dependent on the harvest the flood had just destroyed. The cascade did not require an enemy. It did not require a plague. It required only that the margins, which had always been thin, be reduced by one more degree. The bureaucracy was the last thing to collapse. Clay tablets from the final administrative periods of several Sumerian city-states show scribes continuing to record transactions, debts, rations, livestock counts, in archives that would shortly be abandoned and buried for 4,000 years. The gods' accounts were in order. The city was dying. The scribes kept writing because the writing was what they knew, and the system they served had not yet issued instructions for what to do when the system itself was the thing that was ending. And yet people stayed. People continued. People found within this total institution something worth maintaining. The persistence was not heroic. It was not dramatic. It was the persistence of people who had organized their entire interior life around a structure and who continued to find meaning in that structure even when it was failing them, because the alternative was not freedom. The alternative was the unstructured outside, the city beyond the temple walls, which was also failing, also shrinking, also running through its margins. Priests who had served for 20 years inside the complex knew the smell of every corridor. They knew the specific pitch of the chant that opened the morning ritual. They knew which offerings pleased the god of dreams and which ones were accepted only grudgingly according to tradition. This knowledge was not nothing. It was accumulated, embodied, irreplaceable, the product of a life's worth of attention to a world that most people would find suffocating. Within that world, small dignities existed. A scribe who wrote clearly was acknowledged by those who read his tablets. A musician who played well was assigned to the inner sanctuary, closer to the divine presence that gave the whole structure its meaning. A woman in the weaving house who trained younger workers passed something forward, not freedom, but skill, continuity, the thread between one generation and the next. The hope here was not about progress. It was smaller than that. It was about not losing the thread. When we think of Sumer, we tend to think of firsts, the first writing, the first cities, the first law codes, the first literature. We think of Mesopotamia as the cradle of civilization. And that phrase, cradle, carries warmth in it. A soft beginning, a protected start. The reality inside the Sumerian temple was something else entirely. It was a machine of extraordinary sophistication, powered by human beings who had no exit from the machine. The writing that survived was often the record of their labor, their debt, their ration, their reduction to units in a system that operated with divine authority and bureaucratic precision. The civilization that produced humanity's first poetry also produced humanity's first documented debt slavery. The same institution, the same archive, the same clay. What the Sumerians built was not a cradle. It was a structure that absorbed human life completely and made that absorption feel necessary, sacred, and permanent. The people who lived inside it were not primitive. They were not simple. They were managing, adapting, enduring, and occasionally flourishing within a system that had decided, before any of them were born, exactly what their lives would cost. That cost was paid in full, every day, in grain and labor and silence and the quiet performance of rituals that kept a civilization alive long enough to leave its tablets in the ground for us to read. If you had been assigned to this temple at birth, as a weaver's child, as a musician's apprentice, as a scribe in training, how many years do you think it would take before the ritual felt like breath? Before the obligation felt like identity? Leave your answer below. If this video reached something in you, subscribe. The next world we enter may offer even less room to breathe.